Welcome back, class. I hope you're all doing well. This is the second video for the look or study of ancient Egypt. Last time we looked at the beginning of the civilization. We looked at the Nile River and how important that was for the beginning of the civilization. And we looked at the gods, some of their gods. We looked at the Rosetta Stone and what an important find that was, so that we were able to then translate many of the hieroglyphs, because before that we didn't really know what they meant. And so it was an important find. Today we are going to jump into the different eras of ancient Egypt. Just like any civilization or countries that has been around for centuries and centuries, there are different eras or different time periods of that country's history. And Egypt is no exception. There's different eras that we are going to be looking at. There's the Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, different dynasties. And we'll be looking at that in some detail here today. Not in great detail, because this is still an overview of the Egyptian civilization. Then we are going to move into a short study on mummification. It was very important to the Egyptians for the care of the body after it died, and helping that body get to the afterlife. And so they would mummify the bodies in a very unique way. And so we're going to look at that also here today. So hang on tight. We're going to move into our PowerPoint next. Okay, class, we're going to look at the different periods of Egyptian history. Like I said, many civilizations that lasted for centuries would have different periods within their history, and Egypt has this also. So as we look at this, we have to remember that the beginning part of the timeline that is on the screen is debated in regards to when it actually started, based on the sources of the information. The Old Kingdom would have been around, some people believe around 3000 BC. So that period of Egyptian history is called the Old Kingdom. And the beginning part of it was called the Archaic Old Kingdom, and that lasted till about 2600 BC. And then from 2600 to 2100 BC, just Old Kingdom proper. Remember Menes, he established the first Egyptian dynasty. He was the earliest to have any kind of written record. And following him were many dynasties that spanned several thousand years. His capital city was Memphis, and that is where he ruled from. At the peak of Egyptian power during the period from about 2000 BC to 1200 BC, the city of Thebes, Thebes, which is several hundred kilometers up the Nile River, that was also a great place of importance. The three great pyramids of Giza, which I'm sure you are very familiar with in pictures, the very large pyramids, were built between 2550 BC and 2470 BC for Khufu, his son Khafre, he was probably the one that was responsible for the building of the Great Sphinx, and Khufu's grandson Menkaure. So the three pyramids are for Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And we see in the Old Kingdom the Egyptian practice of mummification begins. The earliest known example of any mummified body is the internal organs of Khufu's mother, Hetepheres, Hetepheres. Her body is lost. There is no mummified body of her, but her innards survive in canopic jars, which they play an essential part in mummification. The next period is the first intermediate period, 2156 BC, and this was a century of anarchy, covering the 7th to 10th dynasties, maybe around 2130 to 2000 BC, around that time, but 2156 is the date to know. Not much is known about this period, but the pharaoh's power was very weak during this time. We then go to the Middle Kingdom, as you see there on the screen. Mentahotep II, that's his name. He had a throne name called Nebheperte, but Mentahotep II wins control of the whole country around 2000 BC, and his base is Thebes, which now begins a central role in ancient Egypt, though relatively little survives of his monuments in the region. He was the first to try to colonize Nubia, which is further south. This region was important for the trade, for luxuries. There were mines in Nubia, and that's where they had most of their gold from. Ivory and ebony, leopard skins, ostriches. They would travel down the Nile River to trade with the Egyptians. So Nubia was important, and Mentahotep II was notable for trying to colonize Nubia. The second intermediate period, 1640, was a time where some foreign rulers came in called the Hyksos. Hyksos, Hyksos, Hyksos. They were foreign rulers. That's what it means, foreign rulers. And they were basically horse-riding nomads, and they introduced horses to Egypt and also introduced horse-drawn chariots, which gave, when the Egyptians adopted this, it gave them significant military advantage. Their weaponry was bronze and bronze-tipped arrows. When they came in and opposed the Egyptians, who the Egyptians at that time only had wooden weapons, so Hyksos was able to defeat them. And approximately 1674 BC, Memphis was captured. Hyksos rule provoked strong reaction in the Upper Egypt area, and the nobles organized revolts against the Hyksos. So working from Thebes and later on working from Memphis, Egyptian leaders pushed the Hyksos out of the Nile Delta, and they ended up forming the new kingdom. So again, these dates might not line up exactly because of the different sources of the dates, and the archaeologists who found the sources and interpreted the writings. Sometimes the dates do not line up exactly. The next era is the New Kingdom, 1580. This was a prosperous and a productive time for Egypt, providing us the bulk of art and artifacts and architecture, apart from the pyramids. But this is the time period where all of the artifacts are from, and we basically know Egypt and its fame because of the New Kingdom period. Pharaohs of the New Kingdom created at Thebes the great temples of Karnak and the great temples of Luxor. And there's also the Valley of the Tombs of the Kings, is where the pharaohs and nobility would have been buried. The population at this time during the New Kingdom time period was around 4 million people in that fertile area. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom did not build pyramids, but built temples and palaces and huge statues to advertise their power and their authority. The next time period is the Third Intermediate Period, 1070 BC, and this began with the death of Pharaoh Ramesses XI in 1070. That ended the New Kingdom, and it entered into a period of decline and instability. It was marked by division of the state for much of the period, and battles were fought, foreigners invaded, there was conquest by foreigners. It was just a time of decline in Egypt. The late period in 712 is in ancient Egyptian history, again saw a threat of more foreign invaders, and this was dominated by the aggression of the hated Persians. They hated the Persians, and the Persians were aggressors here. The late period started the 26th dynasty with rulers that were based in the city of Sais, which was the first of the Persian conquests of Egypt. The rule of the kings based in the city of Mendes, and the second Persian conquest of Egypt ended with the death of Alexander the Great. So this late period extended from 664 until 332 BC. And it moved actually into from the 26th to the 31st dynasty. So you see different families are ruling during this time. And then the final era on our timeline here is the Greco-Roman period, 332 BC to 395 AD, which it marks the end of Persian rule. They were defeated by Alexander the Great, who was Greek, and he occupied Egypt and founded the new capital city of Alexandria. But then the Romans, they conquered the Greeks, and so the Romans then had it, and obviously that moves us into the Roman Empire into 395 AD. So this is a look at the brief timeline of the different kingdoms. You don't need to know the dates really or anything, but just be familiar with the names of the timeline. All right, mummification. We're going to conclude this PowerPoint on a look at mummification. Mummification was very important to the Egyptians because of the way that they looked at death. Death was not the end of life. It was the beginning of the next life, and so they believed they needed to prepare for the transition to the next life. The Old Kingdom, only the pharaohs and close relatives were mummified. Ruling elites were the ones mummified, but later on, government officials, wealthy officials, they became mummified, and then under the New Kingdom, this eternal life was then available to normal Egyptians when they were able to be mummified. But it's interesting, the mummification process, and this was a step-by-step process of how mummies were made. So I'm going to run down through this step-by-step process. And when I'm talking about this, just think of the amount of time it took to mummify a body. The first thing they would do was they would insert a hook through a hole near the nose and go in there and stir up the brain and pull the brain out of the skull through this hole. After the brain was removed, they would make a cut on the left-hand side of the body near the stomach and go in and remove all of the internal organs. They would take the internal organs and let them dry out. Once the organs were dried out, they would place the lungs the intestines, the stomach, and the liver inside canopic jars. They would place the heart back inside the body. They would rinse the body with wine and spices, and then they would cover the corpse with salt for 70 days. So you think about that, for over 2 months, the body would, minus the organs, except the heart, would be covered in salt. After 40 days, the body, they would stuff the body with linen or with sand to kind of give the body its human shape again, since the organs, especially the abdominal organs, are removed. There's not much there to hold the abdomen open or full, so they would stuff it with linen or sand to give it its shape back. And then after 70 days, they would wrap the body from head to toe in bandages. So you have 70 days of salt, 40 days, they would let the body sit for 40 days with the stuffing inside of it, and then they would take the stuffed body and wrap it, and it would sit there for 70 days, and it was wrapped head to toe, and then it was placed in a sarcophagus, which was like a coffin, a decorative coffin. All right, so you see a couple pictures here of some real mummified Egyptians. You can see how well preserved they are. All right, so embalming, canopic jars, each jar would contain a mummified organ. And so here's some pictures of some canopic jars. So they would have had the organs in each one of these jars. They were 4 in number, each for the safekeeping of the stomach, the intestines, the lungs, and the liver. And they believed that the mummy, or the deceased person, needed these 4 organs for the afterlife. Now, there was no heart in a jar, so there was no jar for the heart. The Egyptians believed it to be the seat of the soul, and so they left the heart inside the body. They did not want to separate the soul from the body. So that's it. That's going to be it for the PowerPoint. There's a few more things that we're going to be looking at in the next PowerPoint that deal with the social stratification, because I mentioned here that some of the people that were able to be mummified were the nobility, or the higher up government officials, or the pharaoh. And it wasn't until later on in the New Kingdom that normal mortal Egyptians were allowed to be mummified. So you start seeing some social classes. So I'm going to be touching on that next time. All right, class, that's good for our PowerPoint today. What do you think of that mummification process? I'm very thankful that we don't have to do that, especially here in the United States culture today, to take care of the deceased. But it was very important to the Egyptians. They had their belief in the afterlife and what they needed to do to help the deceased person, the nobility or the pharaoh, to move into the afterlife. So a really good look today of the dynasties, the eras, and the mummification process. And we'll pick up the lecture here next time.